Welcome everybody to the second session of the International Conference on the Governance of AI, Meaningful Inclusivity in Governing the AI Revolution. We had our first, this is the second of two so far in this series. We had our first meeting on the 23rd of March, where we looked at catalyzing cooperation, working together across governance initiatives. It was a very good session and very productive. And we received quite a lot of input from a number of major international AI initiatives, including that of the UN Secretary General and his digital roadmap, of the OECD, the ICGAI, the Church of Madrid. And we also had the Chinese perspective on international governance of AI. We focused upon creative means governing fast-moving emerging technology deployment and to reform multilateral governance. And we underscored the challenge of instilling trust in governance and the criteria for establishing such trust. We looked at the challenges posed by emerging technologies and asked if they can be effectively governed through reforms to existing institutions or if new governance mechanisms might be needed. Today, we will reflect upon inclusivity and multi-stakeholder input into the international governance of AI with two panels and a conversation. And it's my great pleasure to hand over to my co-chair, Nanjira Sambuli, who, as most of you will know, is a tech policy and governance analyst. She will give a short introduction on the subject as she starts her moderation of our first panel on who are the key stakeholders. Our second panel on how do we engage specific stakeholder groups will be chaired by Anja Kaspersen, a senior fellow with the Carnegie Council of Ethics and International Affairs. Nanjira, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you join us today. I'll just make a quick remark about the conversation we're about to have on key stakeholders. It's as many of you will know, inclusivity and inclusion is a tricky matter when it comes to our diverse makeup as a population and global population. So as we go into the first panel that will look at some presentations on key stakeholders, I do encourage you to think about which groups may not as yet be represented. Please share your thoughts via the chat function. Let's hold space for those community groups that we may not necessarily bring to mind immediately, and make sure that we take stock of who else should be involved in these conversations. We'll have about 5 presentations, and hopefully we'll have a quick Q&A with the speakers before handing over to Anja to chair the second session. And so without much further ado, I'll hand over to the first presenter, Zlatko Lagumdzija, and I know I butchered your name, I apologize, Zlatko. Zlatko is a professor at University of Sarajevo, and is a former Prime Minister of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and is a member of Club de Madrid. Zlatko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nanjira. First, I want to thank you, Nanjira, for such nice words, and of course to Wendell and Michael. And I will stop in here because otherwise, if I want to thank to everyone, 4 minutes is not enough. So I'll talk a little bit about what we did as in the Club de Madrid with some of my friends and related things that are perfectly fitting in this topic of meaningful inclusiveness in governing artificial intelligence from the perspective of something which we designed as a Club de Madrid together with Boston Global Forum, which is called in Social Contract for the Age of Artificial Intelligence, proceeding to Artificial Intelligence International Accord, and hoping to end in something which will be some kind of platform, which I call International Artificial Intelligence Agency. Multi-stakeholderism is definitely the key pillar of all these thoughts that I'm going to share with you. It's not about only how many ideas any one of us have, but it is more about how many of them we ultimately make alive by working together with other stakeholders along shared vision and shared values. So in order to make our ideas alive, I think we have to work on their refinement. By those endeavors have to be accompanied with establishing the proper governance structures. This multi-stakeholder approach, which includes individuals and groups, governments, business entities, civil society and organizations, and academic community, and artificial intelligence assistances, as we call it, to digital policymaking is pushing inclusion of stakeholders one step further in direction of establishing and adjusting proper global governance network for artificial intelligence. So just to remind you that 8 decades ago, physicists were not deciding about what to do with atomic energy. I saw in the previous panel on 13th, which I watched very closely, that some of the speakers were making strong correlation between lessons learned from UN, multilateralism, and the things that we did with the space, especially with atomic energy. So now I think we are in position, like computer scientists are not the ones who are going to be deciding exclusively about what will happen with their invention, like artificial intelligence. It's just like physicists did not have exclusive right to deal with atomic energy. So to put it from another perspective, like the war is too serious to be left only to generals, the same way artificial intelligence is too serious to be left only to computer scientists. I happen to be the one. So I'm speaking that also as a computer scientist. So, and another way around as well. So having in mind the lessons from our recent history in UN dealing with atomic energy, I will just give you a few remarks as a conclusion about the global governance of artificial intelligence. To remind you that back in 1946, UN Atomic Energy Commission was founded by resolution number 1 of the United Nations General Assembly in order to, I quote, to deal with the problems raised by discovery of atomic energy. That commission was officially disbanded 6 years later, with extended threats of Korean War, nuclear race, and Cold War dynamics. So it took UN from 1946 to 1957 to come to something which is called the Independent International Treaty-based International Atomic Energy Agency. The IAEA, as an international organization that seeks to promote peaceful and prosperous use of nuclear energy and inhibits its use for any military purposes, including nuclear weapons, reports both to UN and General Assembly, Security Council, with membership of 171 out of 193 UN member states. So today, I think we urgently need leadership call, and I see our gathering as one of the leadership calls from this profile of people for establishment of IAIA, International Artificial Intelligence Agency, as a next step to understanding the new AI and internet ecosystem for work and life. So using the same words, UN words defining International Atomic Energy Agency, we can say that IAIA is the World Central Intergovernmental Forum for Scientific and Technical Cooperation in the AI field. It works for the safe, secure, and peaceful use of AI and digital governance, contributing to international peace and security in accordance to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to the UN SDGs. End of the quote. So I hope that it will not take 10 years to get from the commission to proper agency when we deal with artificial intelligence, like it took us 10 years to come to some kind of functioning body when it was dealing with atomic energy. And I see today our discussion as some kind of call to leaders to show the wisdom and leadership using science and technology, right? Fruits in order to move our planet in the right direction. And I'll stop in here. 4 minutes, 3 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Zach.
I mean, you know, university professors, we are 45 minutes plus always, you know. So that's I really
indeed
had to.
Well, thank you for giving us quite the opening talk on this matter, and it would be very interesting to discuss more whether the call is for new agencies or to reform existing ones. We can revisit that conversation. Well, up next, I will invite Tricia Ray to join us on screen. Tricia is an associate fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and co-chair of a sci-fi conference. Tricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nanjira, and it is a pleasure to be part of this wonderful session and panel. I will be focusing my intervention on one key set of stakeholders, namely global tech giants, and how the fact that they're primarily driven by the laws, politics, ethics, cultures, and even the dominant language of the country they're based in affects the development and the governance of AI. The first area in which we see this is most fundamental, data. The dominance of tech giants based in a small handful of countries means that many low middle income country governments won't have access to their own citizens' data for developing AI applications and also for use by homegrown entrepreneurs. This is especially a concern for countries that represent smaller markets and thus may not have the leverage or be able to build momentum or even the necessary institutional structures to enact and then enforce legislation to bring this data into their innovation ecosystem. The second area is diversity and inclusion. Technology giants may commit to fostering an open and inclusive environment, but big tech's approach to diversity is often limited to silos as opposed to consistent efforts to diversify across programs and seniority levels. And I mean diversity in terms of national and multidisciplinary perspectives as well. And there's little exploration of how policies made in corporate HQ will conflict and interact with the social, political, or economic contexts of other countries. My third point relates to agenda setting power. The way many international multi-stakeholder forums are designed prevents the meaningful participation of communities and favors or is conducive to participation by those who have the most resources. And so there are barriers like the language of the proceedings, the resources required for sustained presence at these forums, including funding and infrastructure, that become barriers. I'm thrilled that the AI Congress is focusing on broadening stakeholder participation, and I hope they keep this in mind for future iterations as well. This leads me to the final point, which is of cultural erasure. An example would be that English is the dominant language of the global internet. While there are growing efforts to digitize other languages, this also means that languages that are, say, difficult to digitize will get left behind. And then the choices that platforms and like these big tech firms make about which languages they want to invest resources in will further marginalize certain languages and therefore certain communities in the development of AI applications. I will conclude my remarks there. Thanks again to Wendell and Nanjira. I'm excited about what we're building here and look forward to everyone's comments. Thank you.
Trisha, thank you so much for bringing that important perspective, and I hope we can revisit any examples of good practices on meaningful community participation and multi-stakeholderism. Well, up next, I'll invite Cordell Green, the Executive Director of the Broadcasting Commission in Jamaica. Cordell, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to raise 4 points for consideration. The first is that powerful nations are invested in a new AI arms race, which is focused on profits and power. In the result, international cooperation appears to be giving way to AI nationalization. And I think in that scenario, the existing multilateral system will likely not be sufficient for meaningful, inclusive AI governance. And we can see the deficiencies in the multilateral system playing out now with vaccination. The second point is that at a personal level, it appears people are more trusting of relationships than they do institutions. It's an opportunity to embrace direct democracy and put ordinary people at the front and center of governance, particularly the youth. After all, we are in the modern age of the masses, as demonstrated by the Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Occupy, and such movements. So I make a case for considering a movement approach as a way to encompass diverse stakeholders. The third point is for us to consider working through a network of the existing broad range of organizations, individuals, and stakeholders who are already focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. I suggest this approach because the SDGs are meant to address some of the types of AI risks that we are most concerned about: discrimination, bias, oppression, and exclusion. Also, AI is not a widely familiar topic of interest. And unlike HIV, AIDS, cancer, or climate change, there are no broad-based and influential grassroots organizations dealing with AI issues. And the concerns affecting the most vulnerable will not be addressed without that type of civil society mobilization. This has got to be a governance priority. The final point is that if there is no equitable access to data, there will be no real inclusion, simplicity. I therefore suggest that one way for AI governance to be inclusive would be to champion a principle which treats data as we do air as distinct from oil. One is freely available, albeit polluted. The other is proprietary. I admit this idea for some will be as transformational as it will be for others preposterous. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Indeed, Cordell. And let's see if there are comments that come up about that question of making data commons, essentially. Over to Ms. Elaine Donahue, who is the Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford, with the FSI Cyber Policy Center, also at Stanford. Elaine, the floor is yours.
Great, Eileen Donahoe, and I really want to, it's perfect that I'm following Cordell and his comments about the deficiencies of the multilateral system and the fact that ordinary people should be at the center of AI governance. I'm going to briefly talk about how the international human rights law framework, which already serves as one of 3 core pillars at the UN, can still provide an excellent foundation for governance of AI, and also about how the international human rights community thinks about meaningful inclusion and who should the key stakeholders be. First point is that, as I see it, the animating energy behind this whole exercise is a shared recognition that this AI revolution requires governance innovation that meet and match the digital transformation that we have experienced. The AI revolution is an inherently globalizing force, and the effects are inherently transnational and felt across borders, whether it's from inclusion in or exclusion from the AI revolution. And those effects cannot be handled solely by sovereign nation states within domestic jurisdictions and regulatory frameworks. This is where the international human rights framework comes in. There are several features of that existing framework that make it very well suited to international governance of AI. I'll mention 3. The first is that human rights already are internationally recognized norms that have the status of international law. The human rights framework was negotiated in multilateral and multi-stakeholder processes in the aftermath of World War II, which was a crisis of global proportions that we really do not want to ever repeat. Stakeholders from around the world spent years drafting the basic texts of the International Bill of Rights, which really now can be seen as founding documents of the international order. Human rights constitute a shared normative language of the international community. And while we have lots of work to do in articulating how to apply and adhere to those rights in an AI-driven context, we don't need to start from scratch and develop a whole new set of principles. So that's point number 1. The second point is that that makes the international human rights framework well suited to international governance of AI is that it really already speaks to the whole spectrum of risks and challenges that are associated with AI. The human rights framework starts with recognition of the centrality of the human person to governance, and it aims at protecting human dignity and the inherent value of the human person. Many of the concerns we've already heard and been raised that are associated with AI relate to various dimensions of human autonomy, human agency, and human dignity. And these are things that are explicitly referenced in the founding human rights documents. For example, concerns about the right to privacy being eroded from collection of personal data that feeds AI. Concerns about lack of transparency and inherently opaque systems that undermine fairness and the right to due process. Concerns about ubiquitous surveillance facilitated by AI that directly impact the rights to freedom of assembly and association, and also how algorithmically driven platforms, information platforms, and ranking systems can impact free expression, access to information, and even the freedom to form opinions. These are all rights that are explicitly referenced in the founding human rights documents. Many other concerns associated with AI relate to meaningful inclusion, also addressed in the human rights documents. First and foremost, significant concerns have been raised about lack of inclusion in the economic upside and financial benefits of AI. We also have risks of AI that we could exacerbate digital divides, wealth and income inequality, loss of jobs to machines. And all of these things are covered in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. Last point is about key stakeholders. From a human rights point of view, human beings are the key stakeholders. The framework puts primary obligation on government to protect the human rights of citizens, and it also recognizes the role and responsibility of the private sector in respecting human rights. But from the civil society point of view and the human rights community point of view, civil society must also have a seat at the table to protect the rights of citizens in this growing ecosystem. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Eileen. And it'll be interesting to see if we can come back to the question of what are the contention points on implementing the human rights framework in AI governance universally. Well, last but not least for this session, I invite Yi Zhang, who is Professor, Institute of Automation at the Chinese Academy of Sciences and a fellow at the Berggruen China Center. Yi, if you may please join us on camera, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's been an honor to interact here. I was born as an AI scientist, so it's really glad to explore the topic from the perspective of a technical developer, I would say. So the first point that I would like to raise is really about the next generation. That when we're talking about the technology impact to the current generation, we're very uncertain actually ourselves. So when it comes to next generation, and then you could say that they're not mature enough, and then maybe we could make decisions for them as parents, and then you yourself is not really sure where are we going for the next generation of AI on its impact to the society. So how can we really get a really good decision for the next generation? I'm really, as a father myself, I'm really scared to actually to make decisions for my own children, for their future, on what kind of impact of does the AI services may do to them. So that's my first concern. And as a technical researcher myself, I'm also really worried about this AI scientists, developers, and designers as myself. The reason is that in the National Governance Committee of New Generation AI in China, when we developed the principles, so we have responsible AI. So people were asking, so who is really responsible? Are you expecting AI to be responsible, or you're talking about AI actors to be responsible? And then people argue, of course, really AI actors that needs to be responsible. Okay, then we go to developers and scientists, and then you see that people claim that, we're totally complying with the privacy regulations, let's say for GDPR, where we have data erasure. And then some companies argue that they're 100% comply with GDPR. Well, my idea is no one is really 100% comply with GDPR. The reason is that talking about data erasure is really easy to erase the data from database, but it will be nearly impossible in current AI models to erase the user's features and their data from the trained AI model. That means from the technical perspective, we don't really have a solution for now. Another perspective is that when people are talking about federated learning, they say that, oh, we don't need your specific data, so your privacy is preserved. Well, the true story is that they train their model by using a version of the data, or where they don't tell you what they use the data for. In this case, they don't have proper informed consent. So you see that for many of the perspectives in technology, we're not ready to provide a more responsible AI to the society. And people actually, in many cases, people choose not to talk about it, especially for technical researchers, including myself. So in this case, I would say from the developers and scientists' perspective, of course, we're stakeholders, but we need to be really responsible to make the AI, the next generation of AI, really safe and really ethical for not only for us, but really for the next generation. That is really the future for humanity and the Earth. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Yi, and please do stay on camera as I invite all our other speakers to join us for a quick conversation. Thank you so much for bringing a very unique perspective to this, and I'd love to start with a question to you directly. How do you think then, next generations, and I'm thinking here even of the ones yet unborn, how can we start having them consider us stakeholders in the work, even in the technical work like you were discussing? In Wales, for example, they have a commissioner for future generations whose job is to imagine and represent the unborn generations in government decisions. I'd be curious what your thoughts are about how in the technical community that you're speaking to, these can be the kinds of perspectives that shape the workings, the bits and bobs as they're coming together.
Thank you. We must be talking by concrete examples. I'll give you one really quick example. Is really that the emotion recognition in the classroom, where people find it in China mostly a year ago when pattern recognition was used to recognize whether the students are focused or not in the classroom. And then, well, technology researchers were really enthusiastic because they say, oh, we can actually recognize whether they're focused, whether they're doing something special in the classroom. This is really challenging technology scenario. And then for the parents, some of them said that, well, if it really helps, maybe you can use it, but basically no one liked it. So in China, it's like the Ministry of Science and Technology says that stop it. And then people never learn a lesson because a month later, Carnegie Mellon developed another version. They say that, oh, we're not only using emotion recognition, we have gait recognition that you can recognize your gestures. And then you see that for those developers, they're really excited to have this kind of trying without consideration of what does it mean to the next generation from the perspective of, well, let's say for my girl, it's like 15 years later, and she would like to go to the college. Maybe I would suggest that, oh, maybe go for artificial intelligence. It's super exciting for me. And then she will be like, oh, no, Dad, this guy has been spying on me for more than 15 years. And then you want me to select them as a profession to pursue to spy on others? No way. So that is the long-term impact to the next generation, where the developers, the parents are really not sure about what does it mean to the future generation. That's really killing them. So I would say, so both the parents and the governments are not ready. We have to be quite careful. We were careful, but it's not enough. So we need to think about long-term. Long-term, it's not long-term AI, it's the long-term impact to the next generation. What could happen to them?
Yes, absolutely. And it's not lost on me, for example, that some of the tech giants' children spared these experiments with such technologies. Cordell, let me come back to you on this same topic around young people. And speaking of those who are presently young, and others can also chime in on these points, you spoke about, including young people in governance. Now, in my experience, this is usually said to mean involving them in the deliberation. So having them in the room, but not on the decision-making table. And you also spoke about movement building. I'd love for you to expound a bit more on how we can take that into practice so that we go beyond just name-checking youth and other typically excluded groups.
Sorry, what was the last point after the youth? You said you also spoke.
The movement, you said a movement approach in your presentation.
Yes. Okay, yes. No, I fully appreciate what you're talking about. I'm not really talking about tokenism, which goes beyond youth. It very often involves and is replicated when you talk about South inclusion and so on. And when you dig very deep, you have to ask, is it tokenism or real involvement in decision making? This is why I like the kind of networked movement approach, because the leadership is less centralized and you can empower nodes. And there are nodes that can include youth who are involved in real decision making. They're involved in university systems, in youth leadership, but usually are brought into the frame through a process of quote unquote consultation. I'm not now talking about consultation, I'm talking about real and deep engagement. And to Yi's point, I really see a connection with what Eileen was saying about the human rights dimension, because one of our primary responsibilities to the children we bring into the world is to help determine the health of the world we're going to leave to those children. They have to participate in the process, but adults have a role to play. It's not an infantile society in which we live. So I take her point and would extend it further to say, if we examine the Sustainable Development Goals, if you look at Goal 1, ending poverty in all its forms, including equal rights to new technology, Goal 8 about decent work, Goal 9 about promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, Goal 10, reducing inequality and promoting inclusion of all, Goal 16, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies. If those are not just words and they are to mean something, then I, like Eileen, believe it's good to embed it in the human rights framework. But I strongly support tethering AI governance to the SDGs, because that's the safest way, in my view, to bring in civil society and to avoid the centralization of state decision-making, which is very much influenced by big tech, with whom sometimes they are very much aligned on issues of national defense and security, AI-driven surveillance and control systems.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Eileen, back to you, since you've been invoked already. I think it seems nowadays it's better to just say, I think everybody agrees we to the universal human rights frameworks. The point of departure is how to go about it. What are your thoughts about what is keeping us from actually implementing that as a framework to govern AI and actually just digital technologies broadly?
So I think that, interestingly, many in the technology community are not actually very exposed to the International Human Rights Framework. So it's sort of a basic problem there. I'm just going to comment on the others' comments. Yi-Jung, your comment about youth, to me, the concerns expressed by your own daughter really relate to that inherent sense of human dignity, human agency the desire for human autonomy and the risks associated with AI that really threaten those instinctive needs. So I really appreciate that you commenting on the fact that the next generation is aware of those things instinctively. I will also say that on the topic of meaningful inclusion, we're all aware of the issue of needing to include people in the economic side, and Cordell just re-raised that in conjunction with the SDGs. We're all aware of the need to have diversity in data and the risks associated with failure to do that. But the harder part that you raised earlier is, how do we make sure that the coding community, coding is a form of governance, and that community also needs to be more inclusive. But the hardest part is meaningful inclusiveness in the governance community, in the policy making, in the decision making community. That's where the rubber meets the road. And here I'll just say a closing point, Cordell's point. Multilateralism is no longer going to cut it in the international realm. Multi-stakeholderism that includes only the private sector and governments is not going to cut it. Civil society has to be there to represent the voices of people as the key stakeholders. Otherwise, we have a democracy deficit in governance of AI. So it has to be a very rich notion of multi-stakeholder processes.
Thank you, Eileen. Trisha, you raised a very excellent point about DI as a siloed effort, and I think it really links to some of the points that have been raised about none of these groups either being also a monolithic or just civil society as one big group, right? I was just curious in your point around meaningful community participation and trying to buck the trend on cultural erasure. Are you seeing any emerging good practices on involving folks in proactive governance engagement over and above the typical we make noise from the rooftops and with placards outside the doors of power, where we're seeing practices trying to walk the talk?
Yes, so a lot of the work being done to prevent what I've labeled as cultural erasure in relation to AI has been local stakeholders. So for example, speaking from my perspective, my mother tongue is Bengali. It is one of the 5 most spoken languages in the world, but the script is notoriously hard to digitize. And so universities have been working to digitize it for the last 30 odd years, but it is this slow progress by the stakeholders who are most affected by this issue that has gotten the language to where it is now. Another example of more scattered but local approaches is there are studies auditing multilingual data sets online. And through these audits, you find that there are certain high resource languages that fare well in these data sets in terms of accuracy, but certain languages, especially from a paper that I read recently, African languages that don't do well in these data audits. And so identifying these gaps then helps provide a space for local stakeholders to start initiatives in this area. And yeah, so that's where I'd like to.
Thanks for that. And I do know that part of projects with African languages has been also trying to use voice over and above text to try and bring that into the corpus. Zlatko, last but not least, obviously, just because I wanted to come to you and see if all these considerations figure within your IAIA proposal. How do all these groups come through? And there was a specific question to you about the powers proposed for such an agency. And I would add, who would be the power holders? Zlatko, you're still on mute.
Am I?
There you are.
Good.
There you are.
Excellent. Look, I mean, when you're a computer scientist, you don't do it with computers. So we have all expression, the shoemakers have the worst shoes in the village. So So that's the reason, but I'll go back to your question. I think a very important thing is that when we talk about multi-stakeholderism, we have to be as open and as inclusive as possible. We cannot, let's say, by multi-stakeholder approach, neglect the role of the governments or business community or whatever. There are no doubts that today the governments and business community has the governments are in the driver's seat in today's organized world. Multilateralism generally is on the big waves of changes. And the world is looking for the new ways of restructuring the governance of the global issues in general. And you're absolutely right. I mean, that I agree with the concept that we should connect as much as possible artificial intelligence with SDGs. That's one thing, because SDGs have the same problem in a certain respect, like artificial intelligence. I'll give you example what I'm talking about. What are today's biggest problems of the globe? Health. Who do we have? World Health Organization, right? Education. We have UNESCO. We have UNICEF. They are dealing with education. They are not the only ones who are dealing with health and with education, but there is a global multilateral player in charge of that governance or coordination, not governance, but coordination, promoting the platforms and spreading the culture and creating environment that is friendly for that thing. Who we have today, economy is the big global problem. Who do we have for multilateral for economy? We have World Bank, we have International Monetary Fund, and series of Bretton Woods related organizations. The next one is atomic energy. Who do we have for atomic energy? We have International Atomic Energy Agency. Fine. What are two big? We have 60 years ago, we had that moonshot Apollo as a big generational thing. What is the moonshot Apollo project of our generation? I see two things. One is artificial intelligence and one are SDGs. So I think we need two multilateral, let's call it platforms, organizations like World WHO, like IMF, like International Agency for Atomic Energy, that will be dealing one with SDGs. Let's call it ISDGA, and let's call it Artificial Intelligence A. Okay, so I'm using the same wording when I was promoting IAIA that is used in UN decision and General Assembly and Security Council decision about the role of Atomic Energy International Agency. It says Atomic Energy Agency is the world's central intergovernmental forum for scientific and technical cooperation in the AI field. It works for safe, secure, and peaceful use of atomic energy, just you can say, for our purpose, artificial intelligence and digital governance, contributing to international peace and security in accordance to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to the SDGs. Voila, here we are, the same definition like with Atomic Energy Agency. But as we said in this social contract that we just launched back in September, there were 10 of us from Madam Freiberga, former president of Latvia and president of World Leadership Alliance. I was there with Michael Dukakis, governor, with 2 or 3 professors from Harvard, MIT, and some people who were on your panels as well from Google, and some of the people were involved in this Congress. Our concept of a social contract for the age of artificial intelligence is based on the fact that it has to put together all stakeholders and power centers together. First one are individuals, clients, and groups, and they should be working on data rights and responsibilities, internet rights, education, political participation, and responsibility. Second one are governments. We cannot avoid them. I mean, I used to be one over there, and I know that I couldn't avoid myself when I was there, and I cannot avoid the governments when I'm not in the government. So we have to make pressure. Politicians are dealing because of their programs, but also based on the pressure. We have to press the governments all over the world to be collaborating between themselves and collaborating on the UN international organizations. And the third stakeholder in our social contract age is business entities. Fifth one is civil society and organizations and community. And finally, artificial intelligence agents like IEEE and other organizations that are dealing with such a things. So my point is very simple. I mean, we have to be inclusive, and we should not say governments or us. Multilateral organization, multilateralism or multi-stakeholderism. No. We cannot get rid of multilateralism. Otherwise, we will be utopians, and we could be ludists who are dealing with artificial intelligence by taking hammers and breaking it. So we don't go that direction. we have to be inclusive, include the governments as well, and make them being part of us, not being against us.
Wonderful. What a wonderful, way to close it and to really just center us around the question or understanding that we're talking here about governance that goes beyond governments, but is enforced by governments. Ladies and gentlemen, please raise your virtual hands for this excellent panel of speakers. Thank you so much to Tricia, Zlatko, Cordell, Eileen, and Yiseng. And now I will hand over to Anya, who will chair the second panel that dives deeper into how we engage different stakeholder groups. Thank you once again, everyone.
Many thanks to you, Nanjira, and the speakers and participants in your panel for a really interesting discussion. And as Nanjira said, we are meeting, albeit virtually, today to emphasize the importance of inclusivity when discussing future governance of AI-based systems and adjacent technologies. Thus, the session today kicked off with interventions on who are the stakeholders, which needs to be included in the dialogue around AI governance to ensure meaningful inclusivity. We are now transitioning to an equally important theme. How do we engage specific stakeholder groups? Do we currently have the right platforms for dialogue on AI governance? And as Tricia was referring to earlier, to set agendas? Do we have a shared language to discuss shared challenges and opportunities? And as Eileen mentioned earlier, do we have sufficiently differentiated approaches to allow meaningful engagement across and between stakeholder groups and processes? So many questions. I'm thus thrilled that we have such experienced and diverse speakers with us today in this panel who work tirelessly every day to make sure the voices of children, youth, women, minorities, consumers in all age groups, people with disabilities, and everyday workers working on or impacted by advances in machine learning, autonomous systems, and algorithmic technologies with us today to hopefully answer some of these questions, raise others, and also look for opportunities. So with me today, I have on Children and AI, Biban Kidron, who's the film director and chair of Five Rights Foundation. On Women and Minorities, Renee Cummings with the School of Data Science, University of Virginia. On Consumers, Helena Laurent, Director General of Consumers International. On People with Disabilities, Patrick Lafayette, the CEO of Twin Audio Network. And on Workers' Rights, Christina Kochloch, founder of Why Not Lab. So before I hand over to Biban to kick us off, let me quickly refer our listeners and the participants to our chat function. If you have questions to the speakers, please write them down and I will do my best to integrate as many time allows for in the follow-up dialogue with the speakers following their initial 3 to 4 minute presentations. So first of all, I'm delighted to hand over the floor to Ms. Kidron.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. And I think that you know, I'm about to break out in violent agreement with the previous panel, that many of the things they say are the sort of background of the work of Five Rights. So let me just say that Five Rights Foundation works wherever children and the digital world intersect. And I think most of you on this call will realize that that is increasingly everywhere. And we look at this from the gaze of 3 very practical views. The first is data protection and privacy. The other is child-centered design. And the third is children's rights. And our organization is really set on implementable change. Yeah. And so I really want to start, and it was something that I think was bubbling up in the previous panel, but if I could just make very obvious overlook point that the AI revolution is as much a management revolution as a technological one. And what I mean by that is that the platforms in general that we have in our sites do use tax laws and patent laws, IP laws, and so on. And yet it has claimed a place outside the laws and rights that protect society more generally. Yeah. And so if automated systems are optimized for the benefit of these companies, and if they're optimized for the commercial exploitation of adults, then what we find when we get to the children piece is that they're not recognizing children. They're not recognizing children's rights, and they're not recognizing that children have, in most societies, existing laws, existing rights, and actually a culture by which we treat them with their evolving capacity. And so my argument and our argument is that we are gradually in an on-off, world, actually eroding. We're not only not embedding the rights that children should enjoy, but we are eroding the rights and privileges that they have enjoyed so far. So it is a backwards, it is a regressive step. And I want to take two examples very briefly to show how actually leveraging existing laws and existing rights on behalf of children actually starts to push back at some of this erosion, and why actually the governance point is so important. And the first one is that and I suppose I should declare, as others have done, I am a member of the House of Lords here in the UK, which is our second chamber. And in the context of the Data Protection Act of 2018, I was able to introduce data protection for children. But on the face of the bill, we alluded to children's rights, to the UNCRC. We are a signatory, 196 countries are signatories, and in alluding to that and getting it on the face of the bill, something magical happened. And that was a child suddenly became defined as a person under the age of 18. Now, as many as you will know, that one of the things that's happened to children in the digital world is that actually there is this sort of magical age of adulthood of around 13. And so in one fell swoop, by taking a lever that already existed, we actually brought protections for 14, 15, 16 and 17-year-olds onto the statute book. We also managed to embed the concept of best interests, which is another concept inside the children's rights framework. So as others have said, this actually is not just a philosophical position, but it's a really practical position, because the final law actually ends up saying that it is unlikely that the regulator will deem the commercial interest of a company to be greater than the best interest of a child when it comes into conflict. And as many of you will know, that is a quite distinct thing. So let me move to another example, which is that over the last 3 years, we've had the privilege on behalf of the Council on the Rights of the Child of drafting a general comment. And a general comment is the authoritative document that says how children's rights do apply in a particular environment. And this particular general comment 25, is on children's rights in the digital environment. And I would urge all of you who are talking about international cooperation to actually take a look at this document, because it is quite a shape-shifting thing. It recognizes that children's rights must be embedded in automated systems. It recognizes that they must be by default. And it recognizes that whilst children are and wish to be users on their own account and in their conscious selves, that actually many children are either excluded for a number of reasons, whether it's geography, language, and other factors. But equally, it says many children are affected by the digital environment in ways in which they are not clear, whether it is biometric things in the environment, facial recognition, their finger on the thing, whether it is the way in which AI is used for exam results, or indeed employment and or government resources. And so what the general comment asks states to do is to actually make sure that children's rights are not actually violated by automated systems. And I think this is a really interesting way forward. I'm aware of the time, and I just want to finish on this point. In the course of drafting the general comment, we actually held 69 workshops in 27 countries with over 700 children. And this is something that we take very seriously in Five Rights. All of our work is in the voice of and alongside children's views. And all I can say is that they are hugely enthusiastic about the digital world, but they are absolutely clear that they do not want their privacy invaded automatically. They do not wish to have their location displayed automatically. They do not wish for AI to target them for commercial reasons or to make assumptions about them. And their voice is very clear, and those views are in the general comment 25. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kidron. Very important points made there on a stakeholder group that we all care deeply about, both among participants and speakers. And the next stakeholder group, we will have Renee Cummings to speak on women and minorities.
Thank you so very much. So really my work strives for more authenticity in algorithms. AI, through my work as a data activist, looking at ways in which we could enhance advocacy and do more active evangelism within the communities of minoritized communities and of course women. Because I'm very passionate about AI and new and emerging technologies in general, and spend a lot of my time in the C-suite doing risk management around bias and discrimination in new and emerging technologies. I also seek to introduce or to merge the concept of risk management around AI with a rights-based approach. So much of what I do is about stretching the ethical and creative imagination of AI and moving really beyond the ethics washing and window dressing that we're seeing with many big tech companies just using pretty much women of color as their AI ethicists and really trying to build momentum around that. So I really try to bring an authentic approach to what has been seen as AI ethics theater. So much of the push behind my work at the University of Virginia School of Data Science really is about amplifying the voices of diverse communities and doing a more critical analysis and examination of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the tech space. Something that I do, something that I've been looking at would be a critical examination that speaks to a trauma-informed approach to understanding data and understanding how data has created intergenerational trauma in minoritized communities and in underserved communities in general. Something that is very critical to the work that I do would be looking at the codependency between governments and big tech and really striving to bring a more robust and rigorous ethical appreciation when it comes to issues of accountability and transparency and explainability and black box atrocities in general, including issues of privacy and safety and security, particularly within the realm of criminal justice. I'm a criminologist and criminal psychologist. So the ways in which we deploy algorithms in sentencing, policing, corrections are very important areas as we look at accountability and transparency and explainability. And the deployment of algorithms on the streets as well in the corporate space are areas of my research at this moment, particularly when we speak about the deployment of algorithms on the streets of the world. We are looking at minoritized communities. We are looking at underserved and under-resourced communities. So fairness, algorithmic fairness and fairness in AI when it comes to the ways in which the technology is being deployed and who is visible and which voices are being amplified or not amplified. So it's really, for me, about multi-stakeholder engagement and finding more interactive and dynamic ways to engage communities across the board in understanding this technology. Because if we really want to see a mature AI, we have got to do a lot of groundwork in our communities. So through stakeholder engagement and building community efficacy around the technology and really enhancing the ways in which we can engage communities through the different ways we may choose to communicate about this technology, I really strive to engaging more women, engaging more people of color, engaging just about every group in understanding this technology. You know, most people ask me, what is a data activist? And I always say a data activist is the conscience of the data scientist. So my work is really situated in algorithmic justice. It looks at algorithmic decision-making systems in criminal justice, in particular sentencing, policing, where most of my work is situated, and of course corrections, and just about anywhere algorithms are being used unjustly. So I thank you for that.
Super, Renee. Thank you so much for those very insightful comments. And then to an issue that concerns all of us, being consumers of these technologies, I'm delighted to hand over the floor to Helena Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Anya, and wonderful to be joining this group. I suppose some of you may be asking, why are we talking about consumers specifically on this particular panel? Surely consumerism and the way in which we serve consumers is the source of our problems and why we're in such a pickle. In fact, we'd argue no, because who speaks for you as a consumer, i.e. as somebody who is an actor in the marketplace, where we need a fair, safe and sustainable marketplace for everyone, and where everyone as an actor in that marketplace has both rights and responsibilities. And this is the basis, and I loved what I think Biban talked about earlier. This is the basis of a legal framework and system which is in place. It's the consumer protection, which is invisible to many of us in certain countries where it's been in place for a long time, but is in fact very new in others. And it's the consumer rights principles that underlie that I think can be a source of innovation and of social justice and of meeting our SDGs, and part of this puzzle that we need to build together. You may not know, consumer rights, consumer principles were not talked about until about 1962, when it was JFK who brought up 4. These now sit at the United Nations in the form of guidelines, which United Nations member states have signed up to. In 85, those were updated to include sustainable consumption. And it is intriguing to me that so many of us, even if you're trained in marketing and ethics, don't know what basic consumer protection rights are. And they are the right to be informed about the products and services that you buy, for your voice to be heard back into the marketplace, for there to be choice, for there to be safety in the products and services, for there to be redress, for us to be informed about sustainable consumption, and for all of those rights to be as strong online as they are in the traditional marketplace. And beyond that, our market should be, it should serve us in terms of health and the environment. Now, if you start actually thinking about those, and thinking about how they apply, it becomes a really interesting conversation. Remember that in certain places, in Zimbabwe, India, just to name 2, there has not been a Consumer Protection Act in place until about 2019. So where we come in, and Consumers International is a network. I loved what was said earlier about the power of networks. We are 200 groups in 100 countries around the world that fight for those consumer rights, either by advising consumers, by testing products, by advocating to business or government, by creating collective efforts of consumers and even by representing consumers in class action. And what you are doing there, what is amazing to see in a fragmenting world is on calls, Bhutan, Uruguay, Uganda, just to name three, collectively talking about the way in which consumer rights are expressed in the marketplace. And this applies then to the digital world and AI. And what we look for is not how this is made, but the impact that this has in the marketplace. So in Australia, Choice recently looked at the way in which online dating sites discriminate against the elderly, in fact, through a price discrimination, personalized pricing leading to price discrimination that is not transparent, with prices that were 5 times higher. So you come into this with a sort of economic view of the way in which discrimination is happening. Consumer Reports looking at credit reporting and the way in which if you highlight a certain type of job, you will receive a different credit report. The Hong Kong Consumer Council looking at the ways in which younger consumers are brought into really very poor marketplace practices from a very early age through mobile gaming apps. The Norwegian Consumer Council looking at smart toys and dark patterns. What's particularly interesting as we try and build the next stage of governance together, our German member VZBB highlighted how the work being done to build e-commerce at the WTO may actually undermine our need for transparency, which is being promoted within Europe. And it's this sort of what is actually happening in the marketplace for us as ordinary consumers that is so valuable then to put back into these conversations. What we do then as Consumers International is sort of bring this together, try to create the international picture, and then bring that into conversations such at the OECD, at UNCTAD, where this can become a really good collective conversation. Now, how we improve this, which is the question, is let us develop those types of mystery shopping, of ways in which we can highlight where problems and discrimination are being generated faster and bring them to the attention of those regulators who can act in the international cooperative and collaborative efforts that they're building. Sharing with consumers more about what they can watch out for, recognizing that they have a very limited period of time and there is an awful lot that we're expecting consumers to understand. Finding agile ways to connect into policymakers, engaging the younger generation of consumer advocates, which gives you incredible faith, because this is a group who have the aspiration towards a fair, safe and sustainable marketplace, and some of the incredible tools in both advocacy and legal consumer protection to be able to change. And then finally, to start thinking about consumer protection by design. I mentioned at the start, it's extraordinary that you can go through an entire education on marketing design and talk with groups of advertisers, and they have never once heard about consumer rights. It comes at the end of process in business. It comes as a legal check and balance at the end. This is a source of innovation. This is a source of building in trust from the start, and a source of reaching forward, in particular to the SDG 12, which really calls on us to create an entirely new system for our marketplace of sustainable consumption and production. And so I would really love to see, as we move towards 2030 and beyond, a regeneration of our understanding of just the basic principles of consumer rights, and a revolution in the way that we incorporate them in how we think about our marketplace. So thank you, and it's been a pleasure being able to listen to other panelists and learn, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Excuse me.
Excellent. So very interesting from Helena here on both the role of and also in some ways the untapped potential of consumer councils and consumer associations when discussing future governance of AI. With that, I want to hand over the floor to Patrick Lafayette.
Good morning. Are you hearing me well?
We can hear you well. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, the City of Prague, and the World Technology Network for inviting me to this second event for the International Congress for the Governance of Artificial Intelligence. All protocols observed. My presentation does not reflect the views of all registered categories of disabilities within the Caribbean. I can, however, represent to some degree the opinions and concerns of blind and visually impaired persons within the Caribbean region. As we focus on the necessity of meaningful inclusivity in the context of AI governance and inclusion for persons with disabilities, we have to look at establishing these groups of persons, agencies, and special interest groups as contributing partners that have significant impact on the effective governance of the AI revolution. Additionally, in order to stimulate cooperation among stakeholders, there has to be ongoing dialogue across the region to build a capacity to navigate the challenges posed by new and emerging technologies. Many disabled persons foresee compounded risks in the use of AI unless there is commitment to and prioritization of privacy, ethics, and bias. All types of AI need diverse data sets to prevent algorithms from learning bias or coming up with results that discriminate against certain groups. My applying for social goods or public service, for example, and the fact that my data information would indicate that I have a disability could be viewed, calculated, and determined as negative and not in my favor to receive these goods and services. There is a critical need to establish AI standards in order to ensure guardrails against violation of privacy and other human rights. With proper ethical practice is observed and bias and discrimination are policed, violators must be severely fined and or punished through the courts. Therefore, as we look forward to legislation of AI policies in governing the AI revolution so that full inclusion of persons with disabilities occur, we must then strive to achieve effective AI governance through the application of a multi-stakeholder approach, where the matrix and the treatment of data must necessarily be open data and accessible by all, from construct to application. We in the Caribbean need to pay a greater attention to making our own contribution to the governance and technological advancements in the development of AI in the region. It is not a far stretch to see how disabled individuals can easily be disadvantaged and marginalized by legislations and policies brought about through a lack of proper inclusion, rules, and regulations or representation within the construct of AI governance that protects the rights of the individual. As Caribbean residents and citizens of independent states, we already have to deal with the problem of our disability, the challenges of our poor economic condition, the lack of viable employment opportunities, and proper education tools and facilities. In most cases, these communities throughout the Caribbean have a great reliance on government for care and social service. Despite the charms and allure that technology offers, I beg your pardon, we are nonetheless cautious. We cannot ignore the stigma attached to government and tech industry who have been guilty of trading and selling personal information. This to us is a major concern. We are in the category of the vulnerable, and we are concerned that our choice and options might be limited to our compliance or willingness to part with personal data. We request that when the AI policies construct is implemented, the disabled people of the Caribbean can be assured that their governments will establish guardrails, watchdog groups, and algorithmic constructs to ensure parity in the governance of artificial intelligence. I'm Patrick Lafayette. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And with that, to our last speakers before we have a small discussion following, which is Christina Kokhlov, with the founder of the Why Not Lab. Over to you, Christina. And I saw you were very active on the chat, so I'm sure there'll be many tangents, to your intervention here. We can also follow up after.
Thank you very much. And it's always a little bit daunting being the last one because so many really good and valid points have been made. I want to pick up actually on what Patrick said around the governance of these new technologies of AI. In workplaces, this governance is, in the majority of cases, totally lacking when it involves the inclusion of workers, their voices, their agreement to first the surveillance they are subject to, but also to how their data is used, how it is inferred, for what purposes, if the data is sold, and so on and so forth. And this is stunning to me. It is stunning that the majority of us in various forms, be we self-employed, in the informal economy, as employed workers, as digital labor platform workers, we are workers. And yet this whole notion of the co-governance of algorithmic systems is totally out of fashion. And here, little wink, wink with a smile to René, in your work you do with the C-suite, include the workers. As I said to the OECD ministers when they had adopted their great AI principles, which I saw Joanna was referring to before in the chat, I said to them, this is great. Now you must ask fair for whom? What is fair for one group of, in my case, workers is not necessarily fair for the other. How can we make those trade-offs, those decisions explicit, but also consensual? In the sense that we at times might have to have positive discrimination towards one group. What is our preparedness for this? And then you can ask, what if we don't do this? So the Why Not Lab, why not? What would happen if we don't do all of this? Then I am afraid that the current commodification of work and workers will continue to the extent that it's almost beyond repair. When the inferences about us predict our behavior, where we as the humans become irrelevant, where we might be chatting in 3 years at a conference like this around how do we defend the right to be human, for all of our fallacies and beauties and good sides and bad sides, that this is what is at stake. Unions have always fought for diverse and inclusive labour markets, and I am very afraid, and I think René's work from the criminology really points in this direction, that we are heading towards a judgment against a norm, a statistic norm, that will exclude lots and lots of people and therefore harm the diversity and inclusion of our labour markets. So my call here is very much, let's find a model for the co-governance of these systems. Let's put workers first. We have the principles in AI of people and planet first. Well, we cannot do that if we actually don't bring dialogue back into vogue. It's also very saying that if you look at the data protection regulations across the world, either workers are directly exempt from being able to enjoy those protections, or workers' data rights are very, very poorly defined. We have that in the CPRA, we have that in Thailand, in Australia. The GDPR even had stronger, in their draft GDPR, stronger articles on specifically workers' data. So my call here would be, bring dialogue back into vogue. We have to stop enemizing one another. We should definitely work on workers' collective data rights, move away from the individual notion of rights as enshrined in much of our law to the collective data rights. We need to balance out this power asymmetry, which is growing to a dangerous and as I said, irreparable level. And then we must really talk about the regulatory requirement for the co-governance of these systems, thereby not saying that workers should have the responsibility. That must lie with the companies, the organizations who are deploying these systems. We need much stronger transparency requirements between the developers and the deployers of these technologies. We must avoid a situation where the developers can hide behind intellectual property or trade secrets to not adjust their algorithms, their training data, and so on. And my last call is we need our governments to up their game. It cannot work in national different laws. We need GPI, we need OECD, we need the United Nations to really start working towards a global governance regime that also caters for value and supply chains, that also caters for varying economic situations in each country, that we must stop what I call the colonialization of much of the developing countries around this digital change. So, you know, this is a macro thing. We need governments to regulate. We really need to get them to the table. I am on the board of GPI, and I can tell you there's resistance to really commit to any form of joint regulation. And we need companies to include their workers. Data protection impact assessments on workers' data must include the workers. Algorithmic systems deployed on workers for scheduling, hiring, or whatever must include the workers. And then we have to all stop minimizing one another. And we must also realize that most of the people listening to this, we are workers and we should have a voice. Thank you. Oh, Anya, have we lost you?
I'm sorry. So thank you, Christina. I think that's a great motto we should all take away from this discussion. Bring dialogue back into vogue. Next time we'll have everyone wear similar T-shirts with that on it. we gotta start somewhere. Lots of really interesting points. I have some questions that came up, you know, listening to all of you. There's been some exchanges on our chat, you know, with some questions and comments back and forth. Well, we're trying to look at how we can engage with participants more proactively beyond chat functions. We're still looking at that. I will, before coming back to each one of you, and so what I will do in the remaining time we have left is that I'm going to go the same order and ask you to comment on what you heard from your colleagues, and I may drop in a question here and there. But first of all, I would like to actually bring in Yi Zheng, who you heard speak before, because he raised a very important point in the chat, which is around data ownership and how to engage with those who build the systems. And this sort of brings to a couple of the points that both Helena and Christina, and I think also Biban was discussing, you know, how do you actually engage those that are on the receiving end of it? And since we are discussing the how, what would that look like? How do we do it? So just like very quick comment from you, Ying, since you raised this in the chat. And maybe questions to our speakers.
Maybe not question, but a more extensive discussion is that because I raised the data erasure problem from a scenario of an international company, saying that of course we're based, our center is in the United States. We have branch in China and of course in Europe. And in Europe, they're totally comply with the GDPR. And then they are technical AI researchers, where they, like what I said, they choose not to talk about the erasing data features and concrete data models of AI from the of users from the AI models. They emphasize on the possibilities and what they do erasing the data from databases. To me, as a technical AI researcher, I was like, this is totally cheating, because you know the data is still in the AI model in many ways. And there are some algorithms that you can reverse those data back to back to the who the data is from, and the data can be recalled in some way to its concrete form, although the version in the database is deleted. So another example. No, let's just focus on this example. So what I would suggest is really that the technical researchers for now is not really responsible. We have to take care of the concrete design. I think the AI ethical principles write very beautifully in every version of what we have in the world. Well, for many of them, they're not technically plausible. So you have to have a lot of technical AI researchers focusing on making it real instead of keeping it as a sound claim. So that's the real world we have to face. And the worst part is people choose not to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Yi-Sang, for adding that to the technical side of the discussion. Biben, over to you. And it was interesting now to get Yi's point on translating good intentions to conscious coding, essentially. And you mentioned that a lot of this is around management. And I thought that was a very interesting point, that the digital revolution is much an issue around management revolution. And there has been quite a few for some time now that has argued that we don't have the right type or the right level of AI fluency among leaders. And I'm now referring to leaders quite broadly, from teachers to government officials, to actually govern this. You mentioned a few examples, you touched upon it in your presentation. Mm-hmm. COVID has shown us that our kids' digital footprint is larger than ever. Yi was just mentioning how that data, the retention of that data, is not really being spoken about. Where do you, and also listening to your co-speakers, can I challenge you to maybe add a few more comments to your initial intervention?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I really want to thank everyone for their contributions, because it just sort of like built up like a Jenga castle of what there is to do. I mean, the one thing that I would do a little bit of I actually want to pick up on something Patrick said about AI standards, but I would like to do a bit of a shout out for data minimization principles, because we spend quite a lot of time talking about what happens once it's out there, and the problem of chasing, deleting, holding, inferring, and so on. And I think that there's a lot of work to do up front about what is taken in the first place, and on what basis, and to what end may inferences be made. So I just think that's something that as a community we should put a bit more focus on. But I do want to pick up on Patrick's thing. And in fact, I think, to be fair, a couple of other people, including Helena, mentioned, this idea of standards, and standards, both literally standards as in IEEE standards and international ISO standards, BSI standards, those kind of standards that we use across many industries, including this one, and can be certified and can find their way as a soft international way of doing certain things, but also standards in terms of actually getting legislators and regulators to say what they mean What is the flaw? And one of the things is that I, who am, quite keen on regulation, also am quite keen to point out that regulation should be a floor. It should not provide a ceiling of what is best. I think there are many versions of best, and there are many versions of interpreting standards and systems that will give us an innovative, creative, and rich world. But what we want is standards that mean that there is a floor beyond which people cannot sink. And to that end, I have to say my experience, and I don't want to overclaim it, but I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years with engineers, and I cannot tell you, how many times I leave the room and the engineer is saying, as they say, I never thought about it like that. I've never thought about it like that. And I think that the point of standards is to force people to think about it like that. and that in that sentence is our collective will, is our, are these international agreements, are the laws, that were mentioned by others, and are the rights agreements and the SDGs and so on. All of these things is to ensure, and in particular, we've been working on a standard, it's the IEEE 2089 standard, which sets out an age-appropriate framework for those companies that want to engage with children. And it literally goes through a set of processes, that an engineer must consider as they design their system. And some of those things will be difficult. Some of them will fall into the category, oh yeah, we can do that easily. We just never thought about it like that. And some of them actually then come back to this corporate will, political will, what are we willing to say we want for society? And so that would be my comment.
Super, thank you, Biban. So we have another 8 minutes to go, so I will go through all of you. So before we wrap up, so over to you, Renee. You spoke about authenticity and diversity, equality, and equity, which are key features of your research. You also spoke about, and I thought was very interesting, that without the critical examination of the traumas that gets reflected into understanding data, we're not going to come out on the right end of doing this responsibly. So while you think about what your co-speakers were speaking about, if you can also elaborate just on that particular point, because I think that's an important point which may not be otherwise well understood, that trauma of data.
Thank you. I think it's really about intention. AI with intention, and what is the intention behind the technology? Because it's about agendas, and it is about what is given priority within the C-suite, within the design space. So as an AI ethicist and data activist, I work a lot with data scientists, and it's really about, as I said, stretching the ethical and creative imagination. But you could only do that by confronting the tough questions and drilling deep into concepts such as implicit bias in technology, looking at bias and discrimination in the data sets. And we're not going to get to data ownership and transparency and explainability and all these fantastic things without being honest and without looking at that source of implicit bias. Within the C-suite, it is beyond sometimes the conceptualization that what is required would be really high levels of intellectual confrontation. So what is required in that space is multidisciplinary thinking when it comes to this technology. So as a criminologist and criminal psychologist and someone now working in data, I think what I spark in that space is an extra kind of interest in ways in which we need to merge different fields and disciplines with this technology. The challenge at the moment is that every organization, every agency, every big tech company has ethical guidelines and standards of conduct and professional standards that must be applied, but we're not seeing that. We're also seeing many big tech companies trying to come up with technical approaches to deal with concepts or bias and discrimination, and it's not really delivering the kinds of results that are required. So it comes back to the thinking behind the technology, and it's something that we're really not looking at. So when I speak about authenticity, I am speaking about being honest, and what we're not seeing is that honesty. So within the context now of trauma, what we have seen with data, we know that data is a power system, and it's about privilege. Who does the collecting, who does the analysis, who does the classification of the data? How is this data used? What is it being used to do? So when we think about the ways in which we are using data, it's a cultural system, it's a political system, it's beyond an economic system. We've got to really think, and that is what we are not seeing, is that authentic approach to understanding data. When we think about the transmission of intergenerational trauma, your trauma is, your data is now your DNA. And we have got to look at that. How we are seeing in certain communities, data is really denying groups access to opportunities, access to resources, access to the kinds of interventions that are required for some communities, particularly underserved, under-resourced, minoritized communities, to build wealth or to participate equally in society. So it really comes back to the courage and the will and the ability to get real about AI, because what we are also seeing is that when we look at many of the institutions, the organizations, the associations that are developing these ethical frameworks and are deploying them, you're looking at these organizations and you're saying, where's the diversity? Where's the inclusion? Where's the equity? So we've got to check ourselves and check the thinking behind the deployment of this technology.
Super, thank you, Renee. So we're gonna check in then with the consumers again. Helena, you mentioned, you said one interesting thing, which is that we have to find better and more agile ways to connect consumers to policymakers, which I think is a very important point. But it sounds easy, but it's not so easy, I know.
So picking up the point about standards, you actually have consumer experts who are brought into standards making. Often they're voluntary and finding the investment to enable people to do that so that it is a balanced conversation. That would be one area. Two, you have consumer advocates in at least 100 countries around the world. Many times those organizations are technically funded by government with some support, which may or may not turn up. There are mechanisms in place which we can enforce and make work. There's something about, if you want to have a Marshall Plan towards, in terms of meeting the SDGs, you can't create everything new. There are some things that, are really beautiful that can be reinvigorated and brought to life in the way that we need them to work now. So perhaps to be brief, that would be my reaction.
Super, thank you, Helena. Important points. And over to you, Patrick, following in the same vein around standards and inclusion.
Thank you. I would just like to echo something from Renee when she said data is your DNA. And that resounds very much throughout my community. You see, one of the issues that we have is with privacy. A great deal of the information that we receive also, it's how it's interpreted for us. And I'll give you an example. Some of the tools that we use to identify and interpret things, like photographs, for example. I'm given a photograph and I now have to visually determine what's in this photograph. Similarly, if I go out on the road, I can wear a glasses. For the time being, I'll have an individual be my eyes. But we're looking forward and ahead where AI will be my eyes. How will some of this interpretation and discrimination of my visual, my ocular reception, how will this occur? What will discern for me or dictate what it is that I see, what it is that I get a chance to interpret? And these are some of the issues that we have when these algorithms are constructed. How much of it takes into consideration the disabled? And being data, our own data, we are very concerned about how our data is used, how it's accessed, how it is sold, how we are discriminated or marginalized. And these issues resound through our community. So when Renee said that our data is our DNA, that resounds with me definitely. The tools that we use, for you, is just an average phone. For us, it's a body part. We rely directly for just about everything in the use of these devices. Unfortunately, we find that these devices are often priced outside of the reach of the ordinary blind individual. So we resort to what we can afford. And when we resort to what we can afford, we also have to resort to applications and supporting third-party tools that we have no input into. We're just receptors of the information. So then any information can be dictated to us and we just have to receive it. Data is our DNA. And I will take that statement with me when I leave this presentation. So once again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Very important points. We could continue for a very long time just on this point. And data is your DNA, and experiences becomes, part of the transaction that is becoming part of, as we roll out AI into our lives. Over to you, Christina, as the last speaker again, before we just wrap up.
On any comment?
Well, I didn't have a specific question for you because we touched on so many areas that relates back to the workers thing, and I will quote you on the Vogue part. But you did say, you ended your previous comment on saying, you were speaking about the co-government of the systems and how companies also needs to include their workers. And maybe you want to have a final comment on what would that look like?
Yeah, well, referring to the chat, because one of the participants, Maria de Exante, was talking about that things are changing, that more and more companies have ethical boards, committees, and so on and so forth. And I, a little bit provokingly, answered to that, well, I don't give a hoot about those ethical boards or committees if they do not include the voice of those affected by these systems. And of course, in companies, in human resources, that would then be the workers, right? And you cannot talk ethics without being inclusive. And let's face it, a lot of the impact assessments that are being made, or the audits, it's in the legal compliance section, and it's sort of down there, and it's by no way included in any form of dialogue or inclusion. And then I want to pick up on something Patrick said again, and Patrick, you seem to be the target of my back comments here, but that is on the affordability. I think we have to be aware, number one, that a lot of these systems that are being deployed are very expensive, i.e. we are breaking the market between small and medium-sized companies who cannot afford these technologies and then those who can. And we're seeing a trend now of off-the-shelf, unadjustable, as Patrick was saying, solutions which do not put privacy or ethics or any of that type of talk very highly, which are more affordable, yes, but I would say more dangerous towards our DNA as people. My last comment would be DNA, yes, it's personal, but it's also cultural, it's also a community thing. And we must really, really take culture far more seriously. I think the colonialization that's going on right now on a geopolitical level and on a technical level has to be discussed in far more detail. So I just want to thank you for inviting me to be here and to being able to listen to all these wonderful speakers. It's been great. Thanks.
Super. Thank you so much, Christina. And with that, I'll hand over to Wendell Wallach. I just wanted to quickly summarize 4 key takeaways from me. Make dialogue vogue, take culture seriously, data is our DNA, and think more about it like that. So with that, Wendell, over to you, and huge thank you to our stellar, excellent speakers for sharing their insights, and to everyone who's been listening.
Thank you ever so much, Anya, and thank you to all of our speakers on both panels. We keep hearing the words inclusivity and multi-stakeholderism as if they are mantras to be repeated over and over again, but without this level of depth and thought about what might truly be entailed as we get involved in multi-stakeholder governance. So I'm most appreciative for the input we had today. As we structured today's session, we put a particular emphasis on those stakeholder groups that are underserved by today's governance structures. But of course, they are not the only stakeholder groups. And the discussion had perhaps also underscored who we didn't include. For example, in Prague, we would have had a panel with very young thought leaders. And of course, even though we alluded to the needs of the younger generations, we did not have any stakeholders who actually spoke for them here. Another thing we would have done in Prague, we would have opened with a panel of AI researchers who have tirelessly championed ethical concerns. In addition to Yi Zheng, who you heard from today, we would have included, excuse me for a moment, we would have included Francesca Rossi, Stuart Russell, Virginia Dignam, Joshua Bengio, Jan Tallinn, Toby Walsh, and there's so many others in the research community who really are taking a leading role. But what I would like us to turn to for the next 20 minutes is a conversation with Maria Accente and with Amandeep Singh Gill about some of the stakeholders who are often seen as having power and the role they are playing in structuring the international governance of AI. In that respect, I mean the role of corporations, of governments, and specifically of the strategic defense planners within those governments. So let me first begin with Maria. Maria is the responsible AI and AI lead for good at PwC in the UK. And together with her colleague, Rob Cargo, they have had a near ubiquitous presence at AI policy conferences for many years now. But Maria, I think, can inform us not only about her perception of the role of corporations in AI governance from the corporate leads that she interacts with, but also can give us a little bit of input from some of PwC's research with corporate leaders. So I know, Maria, you have a somewhat different take than perhaps was expressed by some of our panels on whether corporations are playing a constructive role or whether they are engaged in ethics washing and opacity by design, as they have sometimes been accused of doing. Of course, we do have a few examples, such as Apple on privacy and Microsoft on the use of facial recognition software for surveillance and law enforcement, but I'm hopeful that you can give us much more perspective from your interactions with corporate leaders and from the research done by PwC.
Thank you very much, Wendell, and good afternoon, everyone. Very interesting conversation. I wish I could have attended from the beginning. But from the perspective of PwC, because we are not a technology company, we are a professional services company, we see quite a lot. We talk with everyone who's anyone, including the tech companies, but very interesting governments around the world, but also companies who are not tech companies. And we do quite a lot of research. So we talk with the C-suite, with executives working in AI, just to understand a little bit what's the actual reality in the field. What's the pulse? What are executives thinking and doing when it comes to AI? So every single year we run a CEO survey. We interview close to 5,000 CEOs of organization, small, medium, and large. So we address not just corporation, but everyone who's in the private sector to understand what are their priorities. And surprise or not surprise, in the last 2 years, AI was not a priority for the C-suite. In fact, AI was not even making the long list of priorities in C-suite. And that's because in the previous year, AI was a priority, and C-suite have considered that they have done enough, and meaning that now their AI strategies are more aligned with their business strategy are more aligned with AI. Therefore, they don't need to be concerned that much, but they are very much aware that AI has the potential to be scale up. Hence, they allocate more funds to for not just for experimentation, but for scaling up and accelerating adoption. And the reason it makes me quite optimistic about the state of responsible AI and AI governance is that the message was understood. The external engagement we have had in the last 4 years alone was heard by those executives, and a lot of effort is being done to take those ethical principles and translate it into something that is workable in actions that can support not just the technical teams and know how to deal with the complexities of ethical principles and make them relevant for everyone who's involved, all different stakeholders, but also those who own those solutions. But also very, very importantly, everyone else who's outside the technical remit. So the owners, the ones that are working in different functions and departments, and being able to foster a culture of collaboration and communication. And that's not easy. And the debate I had with Christina on the chat is to say that we have heard from our clients they are doing everything that needs to be done, but it will take time for us to see those results, because what we see right now, that tools that have been built in the last 15, 20 years, where ethical consideration were not included in the design. So I expect that we will see better AI being built in the years to come.
So what do you expect that we will see? I mean, you say it'll be better in years to come. Do you think we will actually see corporations override their fiduciary commitment to their stockholders if that actually means there are areas in which AI could be dangerous or could be destabilizing? Do you think that the corporations will be willing to take up more of their share of the social costs of these technologies that they are implementing? Oftentimes, they are given latitude to innovate, but not necessarily responsibilities for areas in which the technologies they implement may be of disadvantage to some stakeholder groups.
Call me an optimist, but I will say definitely. And this is based not just on the fact that we see a different approach of building AI and governing AI, is the fact that we have quite a rich activity around companies desiring to align profit with purpose, which was, it's surprising and not surprising. Companies that are quite serious in looking at ESG and making ESG not something that a side of their activity, but being the core that drives that the purpose of their organization. That's on one hand. So the leadership is very much aware, and with all the social changes we have seen with Me Too, Black Lives Matters, and all the change in perception. This has now translated in commitment from a lot of the CEOs that create almost like a critical mass and put pressure on other CEOs to react. On the other hand, I'm not going to comment too much on regulation that's coming. On the other hand, we have the consumer who start demanding more and more ethical technology to be deployed, and where competitive advantage is not being seen as something that C-suite will grasp. It will be the pressure of the consumers, with the pressure from the regulator and the public policy, that will drive that change. But I think the better times are ahead. And looking at the reaction we have from our clients and their commitment towards changing the way they operate around the technology and with technology, I say this with confidence that we will see better times ahead. But there will be still areas where we need to be on our toes and be able to continue to challenge and apply pressure, because not everyone will do this willingly and will give up the privileges they have. So we'll need to keep an eye on areas where things do not happen as fast as we can, but we also should acknowledge that good things are happening, and that should give us not just optimism, but the boost we need to continue.
You've been talking, I think we've been using a language which, just to be parsimonious, is a bit generalized, as if all of these corporations fall within one package. And I guess my question is that true, or do we have to discriminate between different groups of corporations? So on the one hand, we have the IT oligopoly, which has become the AI oligopoly. These companies primarily in the United States and in China, that in many respects are more powerful than all but a few countries. On another hand, we have thousands of smaller companies that are deploying artificial intelligence in very discrete silos and discrete industries, whether that's healthcare or finance. Are you seeing the leadership coming from the larger multinational corporations, or are you seeing the leadership coming from the middle level companies that are engaged in particular sectors?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think not all the industries are equal among each other, and also we'll see different responses for different companies. While it's a mixed result, so we see leaders from big organizations that are quite visionary. We also see some that are not following the trend, but also because the pressure that comes with responsible and ethical AI means a lot of organizational change that need to be treated accordingly. We need to provide the right incentives, both positive and negative, for change to happen. But where we see much more interest are in the small and medium organization, where the change is probably a little bit less painful, and they recognize that responsible and ethical AI can be a competitive advantage. So how this will play out in the big scheme of things, I think will depend very much on, first, the country and the regulatory regime, and the play of the governments to address those issues, not just via regulation that would take a lot of time to be created, but also via smart policy and incentives for the right behavior, but also the future of all those industries. I think, remember, one of the things that we'll learn from our CEOs is that AI is a technology that's embedded in the fabric of our society. So we need to understand the AI in the context, or where the value is being created and what happens when that value is being consumed in each of those industries. So I would say that the evolution of this going forward will depend on a lot of factors, but at least we have a good start that will allow us to get us on the right path significantly.
Well, thank you ever so much, Maria, for this perspective. And now let me turn to a little bit of a conversation with Amandeep Singh Gill. Amandeep is now the CEO and project director at IDEA. But before that, he was an Indian ambassador to the UN in Geneva. And in that role, he had a front row perch for the early conversations of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which, for those of you who are not aware of that group, is the group that oversees the creation of arms control treaties, discussing laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems. There was 3 years of preliminary meetings, and then Amandeep was invited to lead the next 3 years of discussion, the group of governmental experts that looked at how we might be able to move forward, at least on limiting, if not actually restricting, the deployment of lethal autonomous weapon systems. So I'm going to start with talking with you in that role, Amandeep, and then I want to turn to another role you took afterwards. But in that role, you and Anya Kasperson, working together with you, were able to get the countries to move forward with at least some preliminary limitations on their behavior. But there seemed to be a fundamental failure in getting a treaty in place that would actually restrict the deployment of lethal autonomous weapons. And I don't want us to talk specifically about lethal autonomous weapons, but about this broader concern that the defense establishments in the larger countries, and more important, the international security dialogue, really dominates an awful lot of what we consider as far as the governance of artificial intelligence, and dominates sometimes in a way where we are being driven toward the weaponization of AI and perhaps a new AI arms race, as opposed to allowing these more domestic concerns, which have been given adequate expression throughout the rest of our symposium today. So can you comment on that a little bit, of how you view the role of the defense establishment and the international security community in the governance of AI?
Thank you, Wendell. There is no military-industrial complex if we look at the AI field. But that doesn't mean that the security applications of AI are not being prioritized by the major powers. So the US, China, and possibly 10 other countries are, in a sense, applying AI, just as AI is being applied in every other field, from oil wells to health, to selling ads to us as consumers. So across the field, from training and logistics to surveillance, intelligence gathering, and so on. It is going to play a role, but not as much as we've seen in the past with some of these, let's say, more specific arms-related technologies. Nuclear is one example, since IEA was mentioned earlier in the debate. I think the bigger concern for me is this overall very competitive view of AI and digital technologies. So if you look at the 30 top economies today, if you look at the contribution of the digital economy to the GDP, it's growing very rapidly compared with the rest of the economy. And 16 of these countries are emerging countries. So it's a different power structure that will emerge. I mean, India, Indonesia are two examples that come to mind. So this, this comfortable binary framework that many in the US are familiar with, whether it was Soviet Union and US in the past, and now for some people, US and China, this is not going to be the future scenario. And that means international regulation efforts would be all that more difficult. Treaties would be hard to agree to, and therefore I think our political capital, our time and energy is better spent on a more flexible palette of norms. And this is what was attempted in the group on lethal autonomous weapon systems. So you begin with principles, you get people to agree that existing law, in particular international humanitarian law, applies. And then over a period of time, you construct some building blocks, normative building blocks around that. So I'll stop there for the moment. I hope I've answered your question, Wendell.
You did. Thank you ever so much. In just a few minutes I have remaining with you, I want to move on to your next role. When the Secretary General created his higher level panel for digital cooperation, you were invited to be one of the two people representing the Secretariat and helping the panel itself fulfill the Secretary's mandate. Now, that panel, which, by the way, included Nanjira and some of our other panelists in these two sessions, that panel came up with a bunch of recommendations. Those recommendations moved on to being turned into a digital roadmap by the Secretary General. But to date, we have not seen any governments or many governments endorse that roadmap. And that raises some fundamental questions as to whether, for example, we will get any kind of multi-stakeholder representation, which was one of the recommendations coming out of the panel. So I don't want you to restrict yourself to the UN, but as you peruse the various international governance initiatives for AI, what is your sense in where we are most likely to be able to move forward?
Yes, and Wendell, I'll also bring in reference to a group on AI ethics that another panelist today, Yi and I were part of. So that happened after the SG's panel, and where we try to take this conversation on principles for AI governance to the next level, mechanisms and ways in which you could get those principles to apply. So it's not just the UN, it's these other agencies as well. But I think what the panel did was start a very nuanced conversation, a 360-degree conversation. And as Eileen mentioned, the 4 pillars across those 4 pillars. So it's not just about this, glamorous field of AI governance, this kind of, set of rules and norms to govern it all. The digital world is layered, and no single entity can rule it all. So I think to be realistic, we should pare down our expectations of a UN treaty on the internet or treaty on AI. What the UN can do is to convene and these underserved communities and the voices that you are trying to highlight, for one, and also to decolonize this discussion a little bit and make it a little less about control and more about control in use. So sometimes I get the impression that the idea is to just wave the finger at people, don't do this, don't do that. I think what the SG's panel tried to highlight was that apart from addressing social harm, you need to promote the SDGs, and you need to do that through an architecture that can communicate use cases and problems to multiple stakeholders, and that can disseminate new data and evidence about the impact of AI and other emerging technologies, so that the discussion on governance are more factful. They're driven by practice, and the practice norms feedback loop kind of tightens. And this way, you also create a loop for the assimilation of soft governance norms at an early stage in the design and development work around AI. And finally, I think these new platforms, this commons architecture that the SG panel highlighted, could make the case for new investments into collaborative research and development, as well as the related digital infrastructures and capacity building that you need in the low-end middle income countries. And if I may have just one final thought on this, essentially, when we talk about AI governance, it's like, one of those mythical creatures that everyone speaks of, which no one has seen. And so sometimes you see it reduced to a list of shared principles. Other times it's conflated with specific mechanisms for certification of algorithmic solutions or ways to protect the privacy of personal data. What I like to see coming out of the experience of the past few years is an approach that's conceptually rooted in the human capability concept, what people are able to do and to be, and a layered governance framework which connects the local to the global.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and unfortunately, we've already exceeded our time, so I'm not able to go into greater depth. But before I turn over the floor to the two co-chairs for their closing comments, I hope you will indulge me in taking a minute or so to do a few thank yous and to also give you some housekeeping information. There was more than 100 advisors to the ICGAI planning meetings, and there were 50 experts who attended meetings to develop proposals for Prague. So many people had given us input, and it's sad that that input had to contract itself down to these two sessions. But we're hopeful that most of what we have developed has also stimulated the broader conversation going on in many of the other initiatives. In particular, I want to thank Anja Kaspersen and Michael Møller, both of whom were constantly available to me, gave me countless suggestions, many of which have been incorporated into the program you were able to view. And I would also like to thank Jim Clark, who the founder of the World Technology Network. Jim has been involved for a few years now in developing the Prague conference and communications, in basically encouraging me to go ahead at many junctures when this initiative might have faltered, and particularly in going ahead and putting on these online meetings. Also, I'd like to thank Olga Litvinek, a graduate student at the Sorbonne, who for the past 2 years has helped us with a wide variety of tasks. And finally, let me thank Melissa Semenuk, Felicia Tam, and the CCEIA media team who have been so helpful in putting on these online sessions. The topics that we have explored for the international governance of AI, they're going to continue to be covered in many forums. Jim Clark, excuse me for a moment. Jim Clark will keep you informed about any additional International Congress for the Governance of AI events. We may even gather in Prague or some other city for a Congress once we're beyond the pandemic. In addition, there's the AI and Equality Initiative that Anja and I started at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. We've already put together some webcasts, podcasts, and transcripts on some of the themes that have been discussed here, and will continue to do so and continue to develop proposals for the international governance in AI. These two events, these two sessions, the one you have just listened to and the one 2 weeks ago, these events will continue to be available on YouTube, and podcasts and transcripts can be accessed at carnegieaie.org. So with that, thank you all, and let me turn this over to Nanjira and Michael for their closing comments.
Nothing much to add over and above that, Wendell. Just to thank everybody for also sticking 15 minutes above the hour. And I really do look forward to seeing how these conversations move beyond, but more importantly, how we go into decision-making elements.
Michael.
Thank you, everyone. Really fantastic conversation today. And last time we met, a great appreciation for all the reflections and the inputs on meaningful inclusivity, bottom-up engagement, multi-stakeholder accountability. One of the things that struck me today was the fact that we are somewhat, every time we have a conversation, I feel that's a greater convergence of views and going in the right direction. We were pretty much agreed, all of us today, on a whole series of issues, all of them quite important and all of them needing more attention. What is clear is multilateral stagnation in addressing these critical issues is simply not unacceptable, but also increasingly dangerous for humanity as a whole. we're moving forward, but my fear is that we're not moving forward fast enough. One of the problems we have, as you will probably agree, is that the speed of adaptation and of acceptance by organizations, by governments, by individuals, to the speed of the development of new technologies, AI and others, is out of sync. We are simply not capable, certainly our political structures are not capable of adapting fast enough. And I think that is a problem. And the only way that really we can speed up that process is by doing exactly what we've been doing today and making sure that we translate these discussions into action as well. People who know what they're talking about, as is patently clear we have seen today, have to be not just at the discussion table, but also around the decision-making table. And you know, our political systems are definitely out of sync with the needs of the existential problems that we have in front of us and needs of solutions. Short-term political systems that have to take decisions that have an effect way beyond the normal election cycle. And that is a very massive structural problem that even pushes us even further for this multi-stakeholder, multilateral approach. And one of the things that was struck me also today when we spoke about the different stakeholder groups that have to be involved in the conversations is how all of us agreed that the role of youth is important. If we are going to, in any meaningful way, come up with solutions that these young people will have to use and be having their hands for dealing with the management of our planet, the sick planet that we are leaving them, they have to be part of the conversation and they have to be part of how we go about our business. It means, you know, all of us stepping outside our boxes to a very large degree. It means changing our mindsets. It means not having our feet solidly planted in the past or in best of cases in the present, and being able to use the future, if you want, in order to manage our daily affairs. And in order to do that, we have to have the young people with us. So let me leave you with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite bosses, Kofi Annan, who said very clearly, and I fully agree with him, that you are never too young to lead and never too old to learn. Thanks to all.
Thank you.